My name is Jake, and if you told me a month ago that I'd be spending Halloween night working the graveyard shift at a rundown Halloween store, I'd have laughed in your face. But here I was, pacing the back aisles of Hallow's End, a pop-up Halloween shop that opened in an old department store just a few days ago. I'd been back in Willowbrook for a couple of months now, looking for some quick work to pay the bills. When I saw the help wanted sign in the dusty window, I figured it would be easy money and maybe even kind of fun. After all, Halloween was my favorite holiday growing up. I used to love pulling pranks with my friends, rigging up scare traps on front porches, and swapping ghost stories at the park after dark. But that was years ago. Since then, life had taken me on a less than straight path. Odd jobs, just trying to keep my head above water. Willowbrook was as much a place to regroup as it was my hometown. It wasn't exactly the bustling hub of the state, and work was hard to come by. That's how I ended up at Hallow's End. The store itself had been thrown together in what used to be Granger's, an old department store on the edge of town. It had been shut down for nearly 20 years, the windows boarded up and the paint peeling from the brickwork. Rumor had it that Granger's closed after a string of strange events. Electrical malfunctions, mysterious fires, and one particularly bad Halloween night that ended in tragedy. Some folks said the place was haunted, but I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories. The job was pretty straightforward. Help customers find costumes, keep the shelves stocked, and run the register. My shift tonight was supposed to end at 10 p.m., but my coworker, Nate, who should have been in charge of closing the store later tonight, needed someone to cover for him, and he did cover for me when I needed to also, so it looked like I was stuck here for a few extra hours, which wasn't exactly my idea of a fun Halloween. Nate was already gathering his stuff. He was a lanky guy with a scruffy beard and wore his Hallow's End uniform shirt half-buttoned. He was always laid back, rarely taking anything seriously. "Hey man," Nate said, tossing me the keys. "Sorry to bail on you like this. My girlfriend wants to hit up that Halloween party over at Lucas's place. You know how it is." "Yeah, sure," I replied, not hiding my disappointment very well. "Enjoy your night." "Hey, at least it'll be easy. Last customer came in almost an hour ago. You'll probably just be sitting around until it's time to lock up," Nate said with a smirk. Just as he turned to leave, the intercom crackled to life overhead. The voice that followed wasn't the pre-recorded message about sales or announcements. It was low, almost a whisper, and unmistakably clear. "You're not ready for tonight." I glanced over at Nate, my brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" He looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Hear what?" "The intercom," I said, still listening to the static that now filled the silence. "It said something weird." Nate shrugged, his usual nonchalant demeanor slipping just a bit. "Probably just some old wiring playing tricks. This place is a relic after all." He shot me a quick grin. "Or maybe the ghost of Old Man Granger is trying to spook you." I forced a chuckle and shook my head. "Get out of here before I change my mind about covering for you." "Will do. Thanks again, man," he said, heading for the door. As the glass door swung shut behind Nate, the bell above it gave a faint jingle, echoing down the dim aisles of the store. The store had settled into an uneasy quiet after Nate left, and it wasn't long before the weight of being alone in the old store began to press down on me. I busied myself with restocking a shelf of plastic pumpkins and fake spider webs, but the silence hung in the air like an unspoken threat, thick and unnerving. Hallow's End, with its narrow aisles and crammed shelves, had a claustrophobic feel to it. The rows of costumes and masks towered over me, their hollow eyes staring down like silent spectators. The store had been hastily arranged for the season, props scattered about, animatronics stationed near the front to greet customers with jump scares, and displays arranged to lead shoppers through a maze of Halloween chaos. The place still had that old department store smell, a mixture of musty carpet and long-forgotten perfumes, overlaid with the synthetic scent of new plastic and latex. I couldn't help but notice the occasional creak in the ceiling, or the distant echo of the building settling. but that was to be expected in a place as old as this. After a while, a few stragglers wandered in. Most were parents with kids looking for last-minute costumes or props. There was the occasional teenager who came in just to check out the decorations, poking fun at the tacky animatronics while laughing nervously as they activated with sudden, jerky movements. As I helped one of the parents find a child's vampire costume, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. "Must be my imagination," I muttered to myself, turning back to the customer with a forced smile. I rang up the costume, watching the little girl giggle as she inspected the fangs in her new plastic vampire teeth. Once they left, the shop's stillness felt heavier than before, like a blanket of quiet that muffled even the faintest sounds. The clock above the counter read 11:15 p.m. I took a moment to breathe, letting the silence settle back in as I started tidying up the aisles. I picked up a severed hand prop that had fallen off one of the shelves and returned it to the display. As I walked back to the counter, I noticed the faint sound of the intercom crackling. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper, a voice I couldn't quite make out, just before it faded into silence. I shook my head and continued towards the front. Just the old wiring acting up, I told myself. Still, I couldn't help but feel like there was something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows between the shelves. The clock read 11:52 p.m. when the door's bell gave a hollow jingle, startling me out of my thoughts. I glanced up, half expecting to see another last-minute customer, or maybe even a group of teenagers up to no good. But as the door swung shut behind the newcomer, a strange chill seemed to sweep through the store. A man stood just inside the doorway, unmoving. His appearance was off, to say the least. He wore a simple, featureless white mask that obscured his entire face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, expressionless surface that gave me an immediate sense of unease. He was tall, dressed in a faded gray coat that hung loosely on his thin frame, which looked weirdly similar to my coat. Something about the way he stood there, the stillness of his posture, felt unnatural. "Can I help you, sir?" I called out, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. There was no response. The man tilted his head slightly, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, without a word, he turned and wandered into the aisles, moving deeper into the store. I watched him as he walked, my eyes following his every step. It wasn't just the mask that made me uneasy. It was the way he moved, like his limbs were too stiff, like each step was carefully measured. And then he disappeared from my line of sight, swallowed up by the rows of costumes and decorations. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should follow him or just wait for him to come back to the counter. But something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I needed to keep an eye on him. I left the counter and headed down the same aisle he'd walked into, moving past shelves filled with rubber bats, fake blood, and plastic gravestones. I reached the end of the aisle and turned the corner, but the man wasn't there. I stopped, listening for any sound, footsteps, shuffling, anything that might indicate where he had gone. But there was nothing, only silence. And then I noticed them, wet footprints, faint but visible, leading away from where I stood and weaving toward the far end of the store. The prints looked fresh, glistening in the dim light as if the man had just stepped out of a puddle. I followed the footprints slowly, my pulse quickening with each step. The trail seemed to wind in a nonsensical pattern, doubling back on itself, as if the man had been wandering aimlessly. As I neared the end of the trail, the bell at the counter rang, the sound echoing through the store. I turned quickly toward the sound, my heart leaping into my throat. There, standing by the counter, was the man in the white mask, staring directly at me, or at least I felt like he was. It was impossible to tell with that blank, featureless face. How did he get back there so quickly? I'd been following his footprints the entire time. There was no way he could have moved past me without me noticing. I hesitated, then walked back toward the counter, my footsteps hesitant. As I drew closer, I saw the man's head tilt slightly, as though he were examining me from behind that blank mask. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say, unsure if I should say anything at all. The store felt colder, the air thick with an unsettling quiet. The man's voice broke the silence, low and hollow, almost as if it were being filtered through the mask. "Midnight is when the store truly opens," he said. I blinked, the words hanging in the air between us. "Excuse me?" I managed, trying to keep my tone steady. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back to me and began walking slowly toward the exit. I watched him go, half expecting him to turn around again, to do something else unnerving. But he just continued toward the door, as if his business here was done. He reached the entrance, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the fog. Before he left, he turned his head slightly, just enough to face me. "You won't be able to leave after midnight, but if you stay, lock the door," he said. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Happy Halloween." The door shut behind him, and I was left standing there in the empty store, staring at the place where he had just been. His words echoed in my mind. "You won't be able to leave after midnight." I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just some weird Halloween prank. Maybe the guy had a friend who worked here and set up the whole thing as a joke. Still, his calm, almost robotic tone kept replaying in my head. I walked to the front door and looked out into the night. The fog outside seemed to have thickened, swirling in a way that almost looked alive. I took a deep breath, then glanced up at the clock. Midnight was less than 5 minutes away. I tried to push the encounter out of my mind as I returned to the aisles, tidying up the displays. But there was a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the strange man or his cryptic words. It was something else, something about the store itself. It felt different now, like the air had shifted somehow. I busied myself by adjusting a stack of masks, making sure they were facing forward. But when I glanced up, I could have sworn one of them had turned to the side, its empty eyes staring directly at me. I glanced at the clock again. The hands had inched past midnight, and for a moment, I considered calling it a night and closing up early. But I hesitated, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. It was just another shift, another Halloween night. Yet the more I tried to convince myself, the stronger the sense of dread grew. The store was eerily quiet. The animatronics scattered throughout the aisles usually emitted the occasional beep or mechanical whir, but now they were silent. I shuddered and turned my attention to straightening a row of costumes, hoping the mundane task would calm my nerves. As I moved between the aisles, I heard a soft crackle, followed by a faint, distorted voice coming through the store's intercom. "You should have listened." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. The voice had been barely audible, as if spoken from a great distance, warped and hollow. I looked up at the speaker. It had to be some sort of prank, right? Maybe a recording that one of the other employees set up for a laugh. I approached the front of the store and peered outside. The fog was so thick now that I could barely make out the outlines of the lampposts. It was as if the entire town had been swallowed up, leaving the store as an island adrift in a sea of mist. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life again. "The fog outside isn't just fog," the voice said. I stepped back from the window, my pulse quickening. Was it just me, or had the voice sounded different this time? More urgent. It seemed impossible, but I could have sworn it was addressing me directly. I shook my head, trying to brush it off as nerves. I was letting the atmosphere of the place get to me, nothing more. Yet the fog's density had increased since I last looked. It was crawling up against the glass doors like liquid smoke, almost as if it were alive. Just as I turned away from the entrance, I heard the bell above the door jingle. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun back around. A man, much older than the last customer. He wore a dark overcoat that reached down to his knees, and his clothes looked outdated, like something from another decade. A faded brown fedora rested on his head, casting a shadow over his face. But even from where I stood, I could see that his skin was pale and drawn, his cheeks sunken as if he hadn't eaten in days. He didn't look directly at me. Instead, he moved past me, his steps slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. The man didn't acknowledge me. He wandered over to a nearby display of masks, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch them. His fingers drifted over the rubber and latex, pausing every now and then as though he were searching for something in particular. As I stood next to the counter, I asked him, "Can I help you find something?" My voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. He stopped, his hand resting on a grotesque mask with an oversized grin, and turned to face me. The angle of his hat made it hard to see his eyes, but there was a dullness to them, a lifelessness that made my skin crawl. "I'm just browsing," he replied, his voice raspy, as if it hadn't been used in years. He tilted his head, as though considering his next words carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know what time it is, would you?" I glanced up at the clock. "It's just after midnight," I said. The man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "Ah, yes, just past midnight. Funny how the night changes after midnight, isn't it?" Before I could respond, the intercom crackled again. The voice was clearer this time, almost as if it were speaking from right beside me. "He isn't here to buy." I snapped my head toward the speaker, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I looked back, the man had moved closer. He was standing only a few feet away. How had he gotten so near without making a sound? He stared at me, his expression blank. "You really ought to keep that door closed," he said, his tone a low murmur. "You never know who might wander in." My mind raced. Was this another prank or something more? The intercom buzzed to life once more. "Tell him it's closing time. Speak with authority. He listens to the rules." I hesitated, looking at the man, who continued to stare at me with that unsettling gaze. The intercom's message had clearly been directed at me. I took a shaky breath and did as the voice instructed. "Sir, it's closing time," I said, trying to sound confident, though my voice trembled. "You need to leave." The man didn't budge. His smile faded, and his face seemed to slacken as he stared at me with hollow eyes. "Please," I repeated, my voice a little firmer this time. "It's closing time." For a long moment, he just stood there, and I feared he wouldn't listen. But then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward the door and began to walk toward it. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if something was pulling at him, resisting his departure. He reached the door, opened it, and stepped out into the fog, which seemed to swallow him whole. The bell chimed faintly as the door closed behind him, but the echo of his presence lingered in the store, filling the air with a strange heaviness. I stood there for a moment, shaken and exhausted, my thoughts racing with questions that had no answers. I had made up my mind. I was done with this. Whatever was happening, it wasn't worth staying here any longer. I locked the front door and started moving from aisle to aisle, putting away stray costumes, straightening out the rows of masks and shutting down the animatronics. But as I worked, a feeling of unease crept over me. I shook it off as best I could, refusing to let paranoia take hold again. I just needed to finish the final preps, lock up, and go. I glanced at the clock. It was nearing 1 in the morning. As I walked past the display of mannequins dressed in costumes, pirates, ghouls, witches, and vampires, I stopped in my tracks. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could have sworn one of the mannequins had shifted its position. The vampire with its outstretched cape seemed to have turned ever so slightly towards me, as if it was peeking over its shoulder. I blinked, convinced my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But then, as I moved away, I heard the faintest shuffle, like the sound of fabric brushing against plastic. I glanced back quickly. The mannequins were as still as ever, positioned exactly where they should be. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and hurried toward the front of the store, every step feeling more urgent than the last. I reached for the keys hanging from my belt. my fingers fumbling as I tried to twist them into the lock at the front door. Then, the intercom crackled to life once more. "The mannequins don't like to be watched. If you see them move, pretend you didn't." I froze, the cold metal of the key slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The voice seemed to seep into my bones. My skin prickled as the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Slowly, almost against my will, I turned to look back toward the mannequins. One of them, the pirate with a hook for a hand, had definitely moved. It was now facing me directly, its glassy eyes fixed on mine. The others remained where they were, but something about them seemed different, like they were poised, ready to shift as soon as I turned away. I kept my gaze steady, refusing to blink. "No way," I muttered to myself. "This can't be happening. It's just a Halloween store. These are just props." But the intercom crackled again, as though in response. "Look away, or they'll know." A shiver crawled down my spine as I forced myself to comply. I turned my back on the mannequins and bent down to pick up the keys. The moment my eyes left them, I heard a faint scraping sound. It was unmistakable, like a plastic foot dragging across the floor. I didn't dare look again. My heart was racing, and I fought to steady my breathing as I rose slowly to my feet. I straightened up, pretending that I hadn't noticed the sound. I took a step toward the back of the store, then another, deliberately keeping my eyes fixed ahead. I could feel them behind me, though, approaching in slow, deliberate increments. I told myself I was imagining things, but the dragging and tapping sounds kept getting closer. I could almost sense the mannequins closing the distance, inching their way toward me. My skin prickled with each silent step, and I resisted the urge to whip around, knowing I couldn't let them see my fear. I hurried my pace, practically jogging toward the employee break room at the back. I needed a moment to catch my breath, to gather my thoughts. This was beyond any kind of prank. It felt like the store itself was alive, bending reality to its will. I slammed the break room door behind me and leaned against it, breathing heavily. I took out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. The intercom clicked again, and this time the voice was much clearer, almost conversational, as if the speaker was right on the other side of the break room door. "They're waiting for you, Jake." The sound of my own name coming from that hollow voice made my blood run cold. I had to get out of here. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I gathered what little courage I had left and pushed the break room door open, stepping back into the store. To my horror, the mannequins were now arranged in a semicircle in the main hallway, blocking the path to the front door. Their expressions seemed to have twisted into exaggerated grins, and they leaned slightly forward as if they were ready to rush me at any moment. I needed another way out. The employee exit at the back. It was my only choice now. I turned and sprinted for it, ignoring the echo of moving plastic behind me. As I reached the exit door, I grabbed the handle and twisted. The door wouldn't budge. It was like the lock had been welded shut. I banged on it in frustration, my breath coming in short gasps. The intercom buzzed one more time, and the voice spoke again, almost gently. "It's closing time, Jake, but I warned you. You can't leave after midnight." I whipped around to face the store and my heart nearly stopped. The mannequins were now only a few feet away, lined up in a row, each one leaning closer, their empty eyes boring into me. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the floor. I scrambled to get up, my gaze darting around for any possible escape. That's when I noticed it, an opening I hadn't seen before, tucked behind one of the costume racks. It was small, almost hidden. I didn't think twice. I crawled through the narrow entryway, my skin prickling with unease. The space beyond was cramped, dust swirling in the dim light filtering through the cracked plaster ceiling. I found myself in what seemed like the back rooms of the old department store, far from the front aisles where the Halloween decorations were on display. These rooms felt like the belly of the beast, long forgotten and left to decay. As I straightened up, I took a quick look around. The space was littered with relics from a time long past. Old broken mannequins with cracked faces and limbs scattered like debris. Empty shelves gathering thick layers of dust and boxes full of old electronics. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like veils, fluttering softly in the draft that whispered through the maze of narrow passages. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the dusty floor, each step stirring up a faint, musty smell that filled the air. The overhead lights flickered sporadically. The air was colder back here, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves absorbed decades of silence and secrets. In the far corner, I noticed something that made my breath hitch, what looked like a basement door. It was different from the others, heavy and made out of metal. Rumors had always surrounded the old department store back when it was Granger's. The whispers among the staff were more than just local gossip. They were tales passed down from the previous generation of workers who remembered the days when the place was still in operation. Some spoke of a fire that had nearly razed the store to the ground one Halloween night. Others mentioned strange disappearances, and there was always talk of this old basement. One tale in particular had lingered in my thoughts, a story about how the basement was used for storage, and how people would sometimes hear voices down there, echoing up from beneath the floorboards, even though it was supposed to be empty. It was said that a worker had gone missing down there just before the store shut down for good. His body was never found. Now, standing there in the cold, dark stillness, I found myself staring at the door. My hand instinctively reached out, brushing the icy metal of the handle. It seemed absurd, but I felt like something on the other side was calling me, some quiet, persistent urge pulling at the edge of my consciousness. It wasn't the kind of curiosity that comes from boredom or mischief. It felt more primal, like something that whispered directly to my bones. The intercom crackled to life, startling me out of my thoughts. I hadn't noticed it before, but the intercom speaker was mounted on the wall here too, though it looked ancient, covered in a thick layer of dust. "If you open that door, you might not come back." I pulled my hand away from the handle as if I'd been burned. I told myself that I needed to find a way to avoid those mannequins and leave the store. But as I took a few steps away, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open reached my ears. I froze, my heart pounding as I glanced back. The air that drifted up from the darkness below was colder than anything I'd felt in the store before, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of old blood. I peered down the dark stairwell that disappeared into pitch-black shadows. I was scared out of my mind, but I thought I didn't really have any other choice. With every step I took down, the air grew colder, the walls seemed to narrow, and I began to feel a faint vibration in the air. As I ventured deeper into the basement, the narrow corridors twisted and turned, leading into rooms that seemed to shift in size and direction, like a maze that had come alive. The walls, lined with faded and peeling wallpaper, felt close and suffocating. There was an eerie sense that the space was far too expansive to be just a basement. It was as though the store's bowels were stretching out, pulling me further in. The deeper I went, the more the layout seemed to defy logic. There were doors that led nowhere, staircases that descended and then ascended to the same level, and rooms that I swore I had already passed through. The few working lights flickered sporadically, casting distorted shadows on the walls, making it feel like the darkness was creeping up behind me. I became acutely aware of the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the empty halls, mingling with the faint hum that seemed to vibrate through the air, like the dull murmur of distant voices. Turning a corner, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A small, neglected theater setup, hidden in the farthest corner of the basement. A dusty stage stood at the center, its faded red curtains drawn halfway closed. Rows of seats stretched out before it, covered in layers of dust that suggested no one had sat there in decades. The stage looked like it was used for in-store Halloween performances in the old Granger's department store days. There were scattered props along the floor, wooden crates, old signs advertising spooktacular Halloween fun, and cobwebs that hung like shrouds over everything. But the most unnerving thing was the mannequins. They were arranged on the stage in various tableaux. Witches gathered around a cauldron, a vampire in a coffin, a scarecrow looming over a child-sized mannequin dressed as a trick-or-treater. Their cracked, expressionless faces glared down at the stage, frozen in scenes of macabre festivity. I felt an uncomfortable tightening in my chest, as though I were intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. As I moved closer to the stage, the flickering lights above brightened suddenly, bathing the mannequins in harsh light. A crackling audio recording began to play, echoing through the room, its quality distorted and ancient, like it had been recorded on a reel-to-reel tape. On this night when shadows fall, the spirits come to heed the call. They walk among the living here to feed upon your deepest fear. The rhyme was followed by a faint hiss of static. My pulse quickened as the mannequins seemed to twitch in the corners of my vision. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, but the movements were unmistakable. The scarecrow's straw-stuffed arm slowly raised, pointing toward me, and the child-sized mannequin tilted its head, taking a stiff, mechanical step forward, as if beckoning me to join their twisted little play. Panic surged through me, and I backed away, my foot catching on a crate as I stumbled. The stage flickered, and the mannequins seemed to grow more lifelike, their limbs moving with eerie fluidity. I turned and fled down a corridor, the distant sound of the crackling recording echoing in my ears. The corridors twisted and shifted as I ran, the walls narrowing, making it feel like the maze was closing in around me. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to thrum with a malevolent energy, as if the very foundation of the store was alive and aware of my presence. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting the mannequins to be following, but the passage behind me was empty, except for that feeling of being watched. I rushed into a small office, pushing the door shut behind me. The room was dimly lit, with dust-covered furniture and old paperwork scattered across a desk. It looked like no one had used this space in years. A large cracked mirror hung on the wall, reflecting the small circle of light from a single dim bulb overhead. I caught my breath and tried to calm my racing heart. That's when I saw a dusty journal lying on the desk, its leather cover faded and peeling. The name Granger was embossed on the cover in gold lettering, half worn away by time. I opened it, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was neat, though the ink was smudged and fading, and as I read the entries, a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy fog. The journal was Granger's confession. He spoke of a pact made long ago, a bargain struck with something ancient and malevolent that had been drawn to the store during Halloween, a time when the barrier between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. In exchange for prosperity and protection from the entity's wrath, Granger had agreed to allow it to claim a caretaker every Halloween, a person who would act as the guardian of the cursed store, ensuring the rituals continued and the entity remained bound within its walls. My blood ran cold as I read the description of the caretaker's role. The journal revealed that the caretaker was trapped in an endless cycle, reliving Halloween night over and over. The chosen person would experience the same strange events, see the same eerie figures, and encounter the same mannequins year after year. Each Halloween, a new caretaker was chosen to take up the role, while the previous one was released, or so it seemed. I backed away from the journal, my mind reeling. The events of tonight began to make a sickening kind of sense. The strange man in the white mask, the old customer, the voice over the intercom, even the animating mannequins. They weren't just random occurrences. They were echoes of the past caretakers, each one reliving their own version of the cycle. Desperate to break free, I turned towards the exit, sprinting down the corridor. The walls seemed to close in as I ran, twisting into narrow pathways that branched off in different directions. But as I neared what I thought was the way out, the intercom crackled again, this time with a calm, almost sympathetic voice. "You can't leave, Jake. Not without completing the ritual." Ignoring the voice, I shoved the final door open and burst into the cold night air. The thick fog outside clung to the ground, swirling in dense patches as if trying to swallow me whole. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath. The fog began to lift, dissipating into nothingness. I could see the main road now, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that I had escaped. But then I glanced down at my watch, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The hands on the face read 11:52 p.m., the exact time when the man in the white mask had first entered the store. A sickening realization settled over me like a shroud. I turned back toward Hallow's end. The building loomed dark and silent, but the front display window shimmered strangely, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. I took a hesitant step closer, my breath misting in the cold air as I approached the glass. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. As I watched, my face began to change. The features I had always known, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, morphed and blurred. The skin grew pale and smooth, melting away until all that was left was a featureless surface, stark white, like the mask the man had worn earlier. I reached up, instinctively touching my face, but my fingers met nothing but a smooth, cold surface. The reflection was no longer me. It was the same faceless figure I had encountered, a perfect mimicry of the man in the white mask. A shiver coursed through me as I looked past the glass and saw something even more disturbing. There, inside the store, behind the counter, was me, my former self, going about the closing duties, as though the night had never unfolded into chaos. It was as if I was watching a replay of the events that had just happened, except I wasn't just a spectator. I was both inside and outside the store at the same time. I staggered back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The realization hit me like a cold blade. This was the loop. I hadn't escaped. I had become part of the cycle. I was the man in the white mask. I took one last look at my faceless reflection in the window, and as I turned away, a voice echoed faintly in my mind, like a whisper carried on the wind. Happy Halloween.